for the 11th Sunday after Pentecost. And I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this before because it's kind of a spiritual haunting of mine, a profound memory that seems too odd really to be true. And so sometimes I wonder if it was just a dream. It's the memory of being in church, listening to stories about Jesus at a very young age, and somehow knowing, even without the words to express it because I was too young to have such words, knowing that grown-ups around me did not believe those stories. Sitting there in that little Tudor-style Episcopal church, a kind of British country chapel nestled next to a McDonald's in downtown Muncie, Indiana, I knew that the adults listening to those stories were just being polite. Don't ask me how a little boy knows such things at age 4 or 5, but I knew I wasn't sitting among a turn the other cheek kind of crowd. In those bad old days of the Cold War, no one was talking about loving Russians any more than they are today. I never heard anyone tell a story with a punchline like that of the prodigal son, except for Jesus. I never saw a widow with 1 penny to her name put her last one in the collection plate, and I was pretty sure no one sitting in that church was giving away all their stuff to people who had nothing. Now I remember sitting there in that little church with its dark stained wood pews and ceiling, and colorful stained glass windows that were stingy with how much light they allowed through, knowing without words that all those adults in their coats and ties and dresses and furs didn't really believe what Jesus was saying or doing. But I also felt as though they would be very polite to him if they ever met. Little kids have good BS detectors. And if you'll pardon my saying so, it's what a friend of mine calls the battleship mouth and rowboat ass syndrome. As I got older, the way all of us do, I came to understand and accept this deep disconnect between Jesus and our social, political, and economic beliefs and values. At first, as happens with many adolescents, I rejected Jesus for the same reasons my parents and adults around me kept him at a kind of polite distance. Under the influence of being a teenager, I'd rather be damned as a heathen than be an obvious hypocrite. And as we age, of course, the benefits of hypocrisy over unvarnished honesty, well, they begin to seem a little more acceptable. To take Jesus seriously is neither safe nor advantageous for people of privilege like most of us or many of those within hearing of this video. All of which brings me to the question begging attention in the Gospel of John today. How is Jesus the bread of life? That's a metaphor itself, of course, and one that is far removed from us in any practical sense. For Jesus and those who knew him, bread was the main course of the day. Bread, like rice throughout Asia, is what kept those people going. But for people of affluence in many parts of the world today, bread just makes a sandwich. Bread is not the main thing, but a sort of little napkin on the side that we nibble. Jesus' bread meant that he was to be the primary staple, the main source of calories. Jesus is the food, the filler, the sustainer, the daily comfort of security in a world in which you never knew if there was going to be enough to eat the next day. Jesus was today's manna as in Exodus, and that was enough for today. Jesus, like bread, was the only thing on a daily basis standing between them and hunger, between them and starvation, between them and death. That's what John is declaring when he has Jesus say that he, Jesus, is the bread of life. But most of us don't really believe that, either about Jesus or about bread. We have no experience of it unless we went through a disaster or some other enormous but unusual sudden deprivation or hazard. And by the way, that's how we know we're privileged. Of the 8 billion or so people who inhabit this planet, only a very small number of us don't give any thought as to whether or not we'll be able to eat tomorrow. Some of us may have had to worry about such things at one point in our lives, but it is likely a distant memory now. In the U.S., the median income is about $44,000, with the average household income of about $89,000. Now, by comparison, the median income across the planet is not quite $3,000. So far as, and also the average global household across the planet is roughly $12,000. So as far as bread goes, our average household income is about 7.5 times that of global households. Now, I'm not bringing this up, this difference between us and the other 8 billion people we share the planet with, so that we can wallow in guilty feelings. Survivor's guilt is a particularly useless and destructive place to tread water. Rather, I mention it so that we can stand the figure of Jesus up next to the comparison that was given to him by his earliest followers. Jesus is the bread of life. And that is to say that he is the thing that makes the difference between wellness and suffering, between life and death. Now, I live with Jesus in some way, almost every day of my life. And the dramatic nature of this original metaphor rarely pierces my awareness. For me, as for many of us, Jesus is someone whose teaching we study and whose wisdom, if we're fortunate and diligent, will influence or even change our lives sometimes. Like Buddha, Moses, Muhammad, or even the mythical Lao Tzu, in their respective religions, Jesus is the one who both gave and represents the core of our spiritual tradition as Christians. But for us, privileged as we are, religion and spirituality are frosting on the cake of life, in which we don't often worry about survival. Our spiritual ancestors, though, whether we're talking about Exodus or John, mostly lived by daily bread. I mean, really lived by daily bread. While you and I can appreciate Jesus from a historical distance, we certainly do not live and die by him. And maybe that's all I want to do today, is just be honest about something I never heard being honest about in my childhood. Maybe all we can do is notice the difference between us and them. Us now, them then. Maybe we can only just put it out that Jesus could be the bread of life if we were that hungry or that needy or that desperate. But we have lots of food and shelter and security, so he is a comforting curiosity that we do not really understand or fully appreciate. For us, as the bread of life, Jesus is an opportunity waiting to happen. Now, don't get me wrong. I do believe on one level that Jesus is the bread of life, or can be the bread of life, just like his early associates claimed. But like many of us, I'm not hungry enough to make him my main course. I'm not desperate enough or needy enough or to take Jesus seriously enough to get myself well in the way that Jesus might heal me. But acknowledging that, saying it out loud, is the first step toward wellness. If you're like me, Jesus is an opportunity waiting to happen. Not only as a benefit for us, but for all those people and creatures and ecosystems across the globe who are injured by us in the way that we live, in the way that we act, and in what we do. And therein lies the secret bread recipe. We can increase our hunger for Jesus by deepening our compassion for those who live in our wake. If we practice increasing our capacity to hold the pain of those who live in the wake of our affluence, we will become hungrier, needier, more desperate even for Jesus. Jesus, as an opportunity waiting to happen, can become the bread of life when we become more compassionate. When we become hyper compassionate even and begin to practice mercy for those who live in our wake, we may even find ourselves feasting on Jesus. Jesus is the bread which, if eaten by us, will actually save others and be good for us too. And we're talking the hearty, grainy Jesus with lots of fiber. Thanks for being here. Please, may peace be with you.